All right, it says it's going. Do we believe it? Alrighty. And I will just double check on our Eventbrite listing to make sure that that guy's working. Since it sounds like some folks are having some trouble. Of course, that's when the mouse sticks. So thank you for bearing with me as I push all of these silly buttons to get to enjoy our virtual author showcase here. And then I just want to record. Aha! All right, so I think that's all the buttons that I can push. It's always a fun game to play. Come back here.
Question, Jessica. I've got this webinar being recorded with continue. Do I need to hit continue? Or no?
Yes, just because it'll get rid of the it's mostly just a notification for you all so that you're not being recorded unknowingly. But yes, good evening, everyone. We are recording tonight's virtual event. We are so excited to be here for our second virtual author showcase of the year with an amazing roster of writers: Terry Kennedy, David Henkin, Dennis Gaub, Bill Lowry, and Katherine Standefer. I'm your host, Jessica, here at the Country Bookshelf on the ancestral unceded land of the Apsallaka Crow, Kootenai, Bitterroot Salish, Cheyenne, Shoshone Bannock, Achady Shikoan, Kalispel, Pend Oreille, South Piikani, Blackfeet, Northern Cheyenne, Chippewa Cree, Assiniboine, Ani Gravant, and the Dakota peoples, among many others. We encourage those of you joining us from outside Bozeman and Montana to learn more about the land that you occupy and the stories of its peoples. We'd also like to encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Eventbrite and social media to stay up to date on all of the bookish happenings here at Country Bookshelf. We've got a great lineup of future virtual and maybe even in-person events. I heard a rumor today, so be sure to follow us for confirmation on the rumor. Before we begin our discussion tonight, I just want to make you aware of a few things with our virtual space. If you didn't add a copy of tonight's books with your registration, we encourage you to visit countrybookshelf.com to purchase those today. I'll be dropping some links in the chat periodically for your convenience. As I mentioned at the top, we are live streaming and recording this event on the Country Bookshelf YouTube channel. So if you're having difficulty with the webinar, I would check out the YouTube stream where you should be able to watch there and catch up anytime on other great virtual events from Country Bookshelf and our Books in Common Northwest Literary Speaker Series. As we go through the event tonight, if you have questions for our authors, just click on the Q&A button down there at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can as time allows. As I mentioned, if you run into tech issues, check out that YouTube stream. And we do like this space to remain welcoming for everyone who's joined us today. So offensive or inappropriate comments or questions will see the user dismissed from the space. Our showcases can look a little different. We'll hear from each author in turn for about 10 minutes, and then there will be a few minutes for questions with even more time for questions at the end. So think of this as going on speed dating with your next great read or reads. If you are a poly reader, I am definitely one of those that has a stack about this tall on my nightstand as I moodily go through. But now for the good part. We are going to kick things off tonight with Terry Kennedy and the search for the Mount Cleveland Five. Terry Kennedy was born in 1954 in Fort Benton, Montana. He lives here in Bozeman with his wife, Diane. He was a seasonal national park ranger and a professional mountain guide in the 1980s. He's climbed in the Alaska Range, the Yukon, the Canadian Rockies, the contiguous United States, and Ama de Blam near Mount Everest in Nepal. So Terry, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. And I do consider it quite an honor to be on the author showcase. And it's also a real thrill to see my book on the shelves of a country bookshelf. It's a real hoot. In Search of the Mount Cleveland Five is a nonfiction narrative that began with the disappearance of 5 young, forward-thinking mountain climbers just after Christmas in 1969. And those 5 young guys were attempting to make the first winter ascent of Mount Cleveland, which is the highest peak in Glacier Park. And they never returned alive. And the interest was the north face of Mount Cleveland, which some of those guys had been planning for quite a few years, even as young climbers. Their base camp was at the base of the north face, but ultimately they were all killed in an avalanche on the west face of the mountain. And they were all between the ages of 18 and 22. They were all raised in Montana, Bozeman, Butte, Helena, Big Fork, and they're between the ages of 18 and 22. And they were all in Montana colleges, 3 of them from MSU and 2 of them from Montana Tech. So it was quite a big event in Montana because all the press, the newspapers, as well as television and radio, carried the progress of this search and rescue. That was very protracted. The rescue began or the search, I should say, began in January 2nd, a day after they were overdue. And the newspapers and the television, followed that all the way through January 10th, when the search was finally called off with bad weather and worsening conditions. And the recovery wasn't made for 6 months. So the last body was recovered on July 4th, 1970. So my life kind of landed in the middle of this when I was 15 years old, because one of the missing guys was Jerry Kanzler, who grew up in the same town I did. And Jerry Kanzler was 3 years older than me. So he was 18 when he disappeared. He was the same age as my sister and went through school with her. And Jerry also had an older brother, 3 years older than he was, and they were very close. And they spent a lot of early days in Glacier Park, even as young kids, school-age kids, with their father, Hal, who was a World War II veteran and was a captain in the Marines and fought on Okinawa. So they were pretty disciplined, but a very close-knit family. And of course, it was such a tragedy for everyone involved. But I was really taken aback by this whole process. It really had an effect on me. And so I made a vow that I was going to carry the torch for the Mount Cleveland Five, and I was going to fashion myself into a climber. And I decided that one day I was going to get to a point where I could climb with Jim Kanzler, who was 6 years older than me, and we'd do the north face of Mount Cleveland. And so the early part of the book is kind of a lead in through a lot of adventures and climbs and mishaps and close calls and that sort of thing, leading up to 1976, when I actually did climb the north face of Mount Cleveland with Jim Kanzler and another good climbing partner of mine, Steve Jackson, who just retired from the Museum of the Rockies as a curator here in Bozeman. So it was at about the same time, I was probably 16 years old, I decided, by golly, I'm going to do this North Face of Mount Cleveland thing, and I'm going to write a book about it. So it only took about 50 years for that to happen. But even when I was going to school in high school, kids would come up to me and they could see that the light had really clicked on. I was going to fashion myself into a climber. But there wasn't a lot of influence around there in those days, but they would come up to me and say, "Hey, Kennedy, when are you going to climb the north face of Mount Cleveland?" And I never really let that, plan be known, except for a couple of really close friends. And I would just kind of shine them on and say, "Hey, thinking in my mind, one day you're going to read about this." So anyway, that was the beginning of the inspiration for it. And so eventually I got up to a good enough level to where I could climb with Jim Kanzler, and we met up. And he was already a real established climber. He'd climbed the northwest face of Half Dome and El Capitan, and had been on some pretty big alpine endeavors prior to that. And so after Mount Cleveland, we went on to some even bigger and better things, as it were. And one climb that was showcased and pretty, local to Glacier and Northwest Montana is in the north face of Mount Saya, which hadn't been climbed either. It's steep enough to where it's been wingsuited off of in recent years. So it's a pretty big project. So a lot of the climbing adventure stuff and technical stuff is about that. I must say, though, that it's not a real technical book. It doesn't have tons of jargon in it. So it was written for the idea that, most people will be able to read it without having to know all the climbing jargon. And so that's kind of the style I tried to write in. So the book goes through, some of these adventures, but some kind of hilarious stories and stuff too, hopefully. And it eventually winds up at the end of the book with Jim Kanzler's son. So his son, Jamie, and I, and another young climber, JP Gambatis, the three of us were in Alaska trying to do a first ascent. And as it turned out, we were in some really bad snow conditions. And we made 2 attempts on this one face. And we, had some close calls there. And so we eventually, retreated off of it. And I thought of that as being the best place to end the book, because it really seemed like we were on the verge of having history repeat itself. And so we'd already been through, 3 generations of Kanzlers: Hal Kanzler, a mountaineer, and of course, Jim, and then his son, Jamie. And just as an aside, there's a 4th Kanzler, James Dillon, Jamie's son, who made the World Cup tour in slopestyle skiing this past winter. So that didn't make the book because the book was out by the time he achieved that. So, but there's kind of that flow through the Kanzlers. And I should say too that I was very privileged to have film that was taken on Jim Anderson's camera, who was one of the Mount Cleveland 5, and he was one of the other 18-year-olds. His family allowed me to use the photographs that actually survived the avalanche. And one of those photos is in the back of the book. I recently gave a slideshow that included a lot of those, and have been pursuing kind of a hypothesis of just how that thing came down. It was sort of like Amelia Earhart. Nobody returned to tell what had happened, and so there's a lot of, it was just a lot of guesstimation. Even the Park Service wasn't sure exactly how it came down, but I did want to point out that the Park Service really did an excellent job with that search and recovery. I mean, that was painstaking, very involved, and they got a great deal of help from the Canadians. So I wanted to point that out, that a lot of the expertise came from the Canadian search and rescue, back in 1969 and 70. And so I just wanted to give them some credit there too. Towards the end of the book, and maybe even before that, but I wrote it into the book at the end, is like, I came to realize that Jim Kanzler was really the sole survivor of that whole thing, because he was in on the early planning, and he would have been on that trip, but he had just gotten a professional ski patrol position at Bridger Bowl outside Bozeman here. And he was married and he had a 1-year-old son, and he had to bow out, and otherwise he would have been there. And of course, with our time that we spent together, he did make the comment. He says, if I would have been there, this never would have happened. You just never know. And so he had a lot of post-traumatic stress, I believe, too. And his life was very traumatic. When the family moved from Clay Falls to Butte, his father, Hal, got a promotion. And, being a World War II veteran over in Okinawa, I think he probably had a lot of PTSD too. And he wound up committing suicide in 1967. And that was just one of the tragedies for Jim, and his life ended in suicide as well. I wanted to point out also in writing the book that in just before the year 2000, probably must have been 1999, I was contacted by a guy named, a professional writer named McKay Jenkins, who is in progress of writing a book called White Death about the search and rescue of this event and search and recovery. And so he and I spent quite a bit of time exchanging emails and spoke on the phone quite a few times. You know, and I was kind of nervous. I thought, wow, he's going to steal all my thunder. He's going to talk about, you know, this whole event and, you know, what am I going to do? But then I realized that, you know, he had a real smooth journalistic, you know, style of writing, very clean and, you know, very factual. And I thought, but hey, I kind of lived through this thing. So what I'm going to be writing is a first person narrative, and that's a whole different ballgame. Plus, so that's why the subtitle is The Aftermath of Montana's Worst Mountaineering Tragedy on Glacier Park's Highest Mountains. So that is how that kind of evolved. And I like to tell people, I said, you know, somebody who wrote for a living probably wrote 10 books in the amount of time it took me to write one, but I wrote my book more than 10 times, which probably everybody does. But it was really a lot of fun writing, especially the rewrites were the most fun because your words don't disappear off the computer, which is very nice, and you can play with it. So that's In Search of the Mount Cleveland 5.
In Search of the Mount Cleveland 5. Fantastic. Dennis has a question for you, Terry. When you talked to family members, was there a reluctance to discuss a subject of such grief?
Yeah, indeed there was. You know, people think that, you know, tragedies like this bring families together, but it doesn't happen that way most of the time. And it was tough. Yeah, definitely. I knew Don Anderson, who was Jim's brother, and we did some early, you know, activity in Glacier Park too. But I could tell there was a reluctance, and some of the other family members, you know, of the other families were pretty reluctant too. They didn't want to open those wounds again, so it was pretty tough.
I'm curious how your experience as a ranger and as a mountaineer may have informed your writing process. How do you typically approach like a mountain climbing problem? And did you find yourself using some of those skills to approach a writing problem?
You know, yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'd have to say that, you know, one comment I would make a lot is, you know, writing the story about the climbs and about the rangering was a lot of fun. You know, it was really fun reliving all of that. So it was the writing was kind of like climbing in a way, but getting the book ready to be printed was harder than all the climbs I ever did put together. So that's one way of doing that. You know, there is one ranger story in there, and you know, and so that, you know, that ties the rangering in a little bit too. Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Terry. Again, if you haven't picked up a copy of In Search of the Mount Cleveland 5, there is a link in the chat. But it's time to change dates. So next up, we will hear from David Henkin and his book, The Week. David Henkin is a Margaret Beirne Professor of History at the University of California in Berkeley, and his previous books include The Postal Age, City Reading, and with Rebecca McLennan, Becoming America, A History of the 21st Century. He lives in San Francisco, California, and Bozeman, Montana. David, what have you got for us?
Hi, everybody. Nice to see all of you. I'm in neither Bozeman nor San Francisco at the moment. I'm visiting elderly family in New York, but I very much wish I were in Bozeman and wish we could be doing this live. Montana is a place I've spent most of my time in for the last few years, and it's been a great place to write, and it's a wonderful place to read also. So like Terry, I'm writing a book about the past, but whereas Terry's book and lots of books about history feature extraordinary events, sort of unusual occurrences that sort of almost stop time and get us to think in new ways about our lives. I'm actually more a historian of the ordinary than the extraordinary, and I'm interested in the things that don't stop time and don't make us think, but the things that we take for granted in our ordinary lives, the things that we all share and the things that strike us as unremarkable until we stop to think about it. So I've always been interested in time and the history of time consciousness, timekeeping, not simply the things that we often think about, which is our devices, our clocks, our watches, or our iPhones, whatever that measure time, or the values that we ascribe to time. Time is money, time is cheap, time is fleeting, that stuff, but also the ways in which we sort of carve up time in our imagination, the way we map it, and the unspoken assumptions we have about what time is. So this long-standing interest of mine brought me to the peculiar thing that is the 7-day week, a timekeeping unit that we take for granted. But it's kind of unusual when you think about it, because the week really finds no model in the natural world. There's nothing that is observable about the week. If we think it's a Tuesday and it turns out to be Wednesday, we can't actually confirm or correct that impression by looking at anything in the stars or in our own bodies even. And for much of recorded history, large parts of the world did just fine without having a week of 7 days or any other duration. So the week is odd. It's clearly artificial, but it's also quite ancient. And it is only recently that the week has come to exert the extraordinary grip that it exerts on our consciousness, on our schedules, on our sense of the passing of time. But it does exert that grip, so much so that forgetting what day of the week it is a singular symptom of temporal disorientation or even cognitive decline. It's something that's, for example, not true if you think it's 3 p.m. and it turns out to be 4 p.m., or if you think it's the 11th and it turns out to be the 10th. That could be possibly inconvenient if you miss an appointment, but it doesn't show that you're sort of out of sync with the world or that your brain isn't functioning properly. But the week stuff does, and I think that grip and that sense of the importance of always knowing where you are in the week was never more clear than in the initial pandemic shutdown, when people were thrown off of their rhythms and their schedules, and their principal complaint about disorientation often focused on the week. We start talking about Blur's Day, or Saturday Night Live said, there's no more Saturday night, every day is just today, that kind of thing. We grasped onto the week to express our more general sense of being unmoored or dislodged from social rhythms and from the passing of time and from the movement of our own lives. So I've always been interested in that. I've always tried to figure out why that is. How do we explain the fact that this completely artificial and only recently global timekeeping unit has this powerful grip on us? So I decided to approach this question historically, because it is essentially a historical question, or set of historical questions. Right? Who are the first people who experienced 7-day rhythms in exactly the way that we do, who became as attached as we are to always knowing what day of the week it was? What made them experience it in that way? How do we know that they experienced it that way? So that's what I set out to write, and I spent maybe not as long as Terry, but I spent probably about 12 years just researching this question, trying to figure out in the history of the United States how the week came to be what it is today. And it's a history book, it has footnotes and evidence and all that. I mean, I did try to write it for general readers, but I'm also trying to prove something. So I show my work as they tell you to do in math class when you're a kid. And it's not a narrative exactly. It's an argument or a set of arguments, and boils down to a few basic ones. First of all, I try to argue in this book and even dramatize a little bit the fact that before 1800, most people in North America did know and did care whether it was Sunday or not, but didn't really have a whole lot of reason to care about where they were in the middle of the cycle. They had lives that were largely similar from one weekday to another. That's one argument. The other is that over the course of the first half of the 19th century in the United States, ordinary people began to have distinctive associations with each day of the week and began to lead lives where it really made a difference whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday. Third, I'm trying to show how, because of that, the week began to lodge in people's memories and began to organize their mental maps of time. So that when they would be asked to recall things that they had witnessed or to review the developments in their lives, especially their recent lives, they would always hold on to the week and the weekly calendar as a way to anchor those memories. And then by the end of the 19th century, once the week had already become this incredible mnemonic device as well as a timekeeping device, the week began to seem so natural and given to people in the United States and in much of the Western world, that when the world became, when the week became a global timekeeping unit, which really only happened in the last 150 years, that it spread to parts of the world that had never had weeks, that seemed normal too. And when people tried to reform the week, as they did both in the Soviet Union and also in the United States and in Western Europe in the 20th century, attempts to reform or even slightly tweak or modify the week failed because the week had already come to seem like built into the fabric of the universe, despite the fact that what built it into the fabric of the universe was entirely social, right? The week is this entirely socially constructed, as they say, timekeeping unit. And it's a timekeeping unit that connects us to other people and their habits. It doesn't necessarily connect us to our bodies or to the heavens or to the needs of our souls. It might not, that's hard to say, but it does connect us to other people. And that is the thing that has made it both practically indispensable and at the same time, a symbol of modern life. So that's what I'm trying to describe here. Again, it's do want to be caveat emptor here. It's not a jargony book, but it is a book with evidence, and so some readers might want to hear the arguments and watch them played out in individual stories, but might not need to look at the appendix or the footnotes or things like that, and that's totally cool. But I do hope that when people read it, it opens up their own consciousness about how it is that time passes and how it is that we all, in really interesting ways, map our social habits onto the most basic features of temporal experience. So that's all.
I really appreciate that idea of time as almost a social geography, like your relationship to other people, more so than anything observable, as you mentioned. There's a really great comment here from Katherine. David, I'm so excited to hear you talk about this. I am neurodivergent time blind, and it's taken years to realize I need to stop teaching weekly classes because it's not the normal interval for the inside of my body. And I can rarely perform on that schedule. But of course, other writers or institutions who want to work with me all have the assumption that being professional means working on a weekly schedule. So they're excited to read your book. And I'm curious to know, as we're 2.5 years into this endemic, and we've seen some major shifts in work and how we work. If you think the rise of asynchronous labor might change our relationship to the week.
Yeah, so I do. Let me say a quick thing about Katherine's observation, which is natural time units also, vary. I'm someone who likes to sleep until noon and stay up till 3 a.m. and that makes me be called unprofessional. Unprofessional often is which I completely confess to being. Unprofessional is often about nonconformity, or as much as it's about artificiality or natural deviation. So I happen not to think that non-natural time zone time units are more oppressive than natural ones, but it's just interesting that they are different. So Jessica's question is really interesting, because when I went into this project feeling like I was talking about the history of this powerful modern timekeeping unit as it was about to disappear, because it did really seem like if people are working in different time zones, and if people are working after hours and working on weekends, all the ways in which the experience of labor has sort of eroded the boundaries that used to hold labor in place. And then not just labor, leisure too. I mean, think of asynchronous entertainment has completely changed the week for so many sectors of the entertainment world. Professional sports is a notable exception, and professional and football in general, American football, is a huge exception. So there are still forms of entertainment that regulate people's weeks by synchronizing their. But I grew up in an era when television did that too, and it obviously doesn't do that anymore. So I was thinking, like, oh, this is going to end, and also electronic calendars that make it possible for us to actually coordinate activities without using the week, as long as our calendars tell us that our computers sync with each other and tell us that we're free. So I was worried, or maybe even excited that I was writing about this at the time. But the more I thought about all the different ways in which people became anchored to the week in the 19th century, and the more ways in which I noticed they were anchored to the week in the 21st century, the more I began to wonder whether it's actually really about to unravel. And the pandemic made me actually more confident in the week's durability, because the pandemic unsettled so many aspects of our lives, and yet people just couldn't handle the fact that they thought it was Wednesday and it turned out to be Thursday. So there somehow, at least for a couple more generations, people have become so attached to the 7-day rhythm that I don't think the changes in labor and entertainment that are significant are about to kill it. So that's my take now. But I agree with Jessica's assumption, Jessica's question, which is like, surely all the stuff around us has got to make the week a little bit less tenacious in its grip. Yeah.
My dad is retired, and so he says that every day is Wednesday. It's just the middle of the week.
Today he's right.
And then Dennis has a question comment also. As a farm boy until age 11, where chores went on regardless of the day of the week, do you discuss how the change from an agrarian society to an industrial society solidified the notion of a 7-day week with time off on the weekends? And I'm just picturing the beautiful Maggie Smith going, "What is a weekend?"
Right. Well, all right. So it is true that the change that I described over the course of the 19th century can be described, because it was in part, as a shift from agrarian to industrial, because the week did so many things other than organize labor. I think it's probably a bigger part of the story is a shift from rural to urban. In other words, even people who were not engaged in industrial labor, so long as they were living in towns and cities, were pretty likely to have lives that differed between Tuesday and Wednesday, even if their work life didn't. And they include things like going to school, housekeeping, whether the mail came, which newspapers arrived, and more the meetings of voluntary associations, of fraternal lodges. So more and more people, even if they weren't technically speaking industrial workers, had reasons to care about the week. But the agricultural story is sort of interesting also because in the United States, lots of agricultural workers did actually have reduced labor on Sunday. And the most striking example is enslaved workers, right? I mean, the vast majority of enslaved people in the United States did not labor for their putative owners on Sundays. They may have labored for themselves, but they were given a day off from labor on plantations. And free family agricultural workers often also had reduced labor on Sunday. There's some chores that had to be done on Sunday, but there were a lot of chores that were suspended on Sunday, and a lot of workers were given the days off on farms. So even I mean, what Dan's saying is totally right, but it's not as stark a difference between rural and urban, and then the difference itself is not exclusively about industrialization.
Fascinating. Well, I hope everyone can visit the link in the chat to grab their copy of The Week by David Henkin. I have the audiobook myself, so 2 thumbs up there. But next, we are excited to move on to our next book date, which is Sky Dreamers by Dennis Gaub. Author Dennis Gaub is educated in Montana schools, received a journalism degree from Northwestern University. He spent 25 years as a newspaper reporter and editor, and then retired from the software industry. He authored 2 previous books, Win 'Em All and Midway Bravery, and he and his wife, Kathy, live in Billings, Montana. Dennis, tell us about Sky Dreamer.
Thank you, Jessica. And before I start, a quick thank you to you fine folks at the Country Bookshelf for graciously hosting me pre-pandemic, almost 2.5 years ago, on a frosty but not icy cold night in Bozeman, when I talked about my second book, nonfiction, Midway Bravery. And also, before I start, as Jessica said, I have long experience in the newspaper business. In fact, I spent about 20 years as a reporter for the Billings Gazette, and that made me a writer, the writer I am. But this was my first venture into fiction. And as I said too, as I've told several people, I had not really ventured into fiction on a serious basis since about my junior year in high school, English comp class. So I approached it with a little bit of fear and trepidation. This book is targeted at middle school readers. So I'm going to ask you, I'll read briefly from it to give you a sense of the story. And I'm going to ask you to adopt the mindset of a boy or girl in the 6th or 7th grade, let's say arbitrarily, in Montana or anywhere in the US a century ago. Someone trying to figure out where he or she is going to be in the world. My father and I hurried through downtown Billings, excitement shooting through my veins like the electricity that raced along wires made from copper mined in Butte and refined in Anaconda and Great Falls. It was a bright spring day in June 1910, and we were walking toward our destination a mile away. There we'd get to watch one of the biggest events to stir up the up-and-coming Montana city we called home. My 8-year-old mind soared as I imagined what awaited me. Father, do you think the Birdman will get his machine in the air? I asked. My father chuckled as he pondered an answer. A German immigrant who owned a busy bakery, he knew the ins and outs of kneading perfect dough, then putting it in the oven for the right time to bring out rye and pumpernickel bread that housewives raved about, or making Berliners, the jelly-filled donuts also called Bismarcks that were the talk of the town, or blending potato water, mashed potatoes, eggs, butter, and flour into a base upon which he spread a custard made of cream, eggs, and sugar, creating a signature German dessert called Kuchen. Flying machines, however, were a complete unknown to Carl Schmidt. Sure, he had read about the contraptions that were creating a buzz across the country as the Wright brothers as the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtiss competed with their designs to capture public imagination. But an actual airplane and pilot were as alien to him and people in Billings as a man on the moon. I don't know, Arnie, he said. No one has ever flown an airplane here or anywhere in Montana, to my knowledge. Be patient and let's see what happened. That was a tall order for me. People said I was the impetuous, adventuresome sort, and they were right. I wanted to see and touch a real airplane. I'd get my wish soon. An occasional Model T sputtered along North Broadway as we passed storefronts, but more riders on horseback and horse-drawn surreys than Henry Ford's jalopies were using the street. Pedestrians found relief from the bright Montana sunshine beneath canopies that spread across sidewalks. Housewives dodged into the modern Stapleton building to shop for clothing, linen, and other household goods from the Hart Albin Company, one of the Treasure State's leading department stores. We reached our destination where several hundred of the pioneer Montana City residents had gathered to gaze at an odd contrivance, the likes of which none of the spectators had ever seen. I overheard one grizzled man in the crowd ask his friend, "What the hell is it?" "It's one of those airplanes, those flying machines, the kind that Orville and Wilbur Wright got in the air a few years ago," said the other man. "Now it's the rage. Everyone thinks they can join the birds." Having read the Billings Gazette over breakfast, I knew something about what we were going to see. The machine in front of us was a Curtiss biplane owned by Eugene Ely, who had shipped it and himself by rail from Portland, Oregon to Billings. He planned an exhibition flight in the Magic City, Billings' nickname because of its explosive population growth. My father and others told me about Billings' origins as a steamboat stop at the head of navigation on the Yellowstone River, where the settlement of Colson was founded in 1877. The hamlet grew to about 300 residents, then vanished when the Northern Pacific Railroad reached what became the site of Billings in 1882. Billings' population mushroomed, and now, less than three decades later, was a city of 10,000 people and still growing by leaps and bounds. "Want to see something new and exciting?" my father said to me over our morning meal of eggs, bacon, and rye bread toast. My answer was an immediate yes. I peppered my father with questions, and he described the machine we would see as best he could see. "What keeps an airplane in the sky?" I said, wondering how something heavier than air avoided crashing to the ground. My father, although not an engineer, possessed enough mechanical sense to explain that a plane's propeller converted motion from its engine into forward thrust so that the plane could get in the air, and that an airplane's wings kept it aloft. My father passed the newspaper to me, and I read a preview of the flight attempt. The paper's reporter used lukewarm words to give readers a sense of the step into the unknown that Ely's plane represented. To one who has never seen an airplane, the Curtiss biplane, which is awaiting at 17th Street and 6th Avenue North, presents a very unassuming sight. The monster bird looks to the inexperienced eye to be an exceptionally simple machine with its wide-spreading wings and trailing tail, but that it is effective is shown by its record. I will read just a little bit of chapter 2, not to belabor it, to give you a little bit more sense and keep an idea of time on mind. As I continue telling my story, drawn from memory from the journal I've kept most of my life and the newspaper clippings I've saved, it's 1957, 55 years since I was born in 1902 in Billings. As a boy, I was slender with brown hair and blue eyes. I stood about 5'4" and would keep my slight build as I grew to 5'8" as an adult. My parents, Carl and Anna, were Germans born in the Black Sea region of Russia, where their ancestors, like thousands of other Germans, had started settling rich farmland in the late 1700s at the invitation of German-born Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. Carl and Anna met and were married in the old country in the summer of 1899, when they were both 21, and migrated to the US about a month later. As with millions of others, they sought a better life free of the rigid restrictions and broken pledges in Russia. Catherine promised us Germans we wouldn't have to serve in the military. Now the Tsar is drafting Germans into the army, my father told me once. After getting off the immigrant steamer that brought them across the Atlantic, my parents were processed at Ellis Island and boarded a train bound for Montana and Billings. One of my mother's brothers, Anton, had migrated from Russia earlier and already lived in Billings, where he first worked as a laborer. He was saving money so he could start farming sugar beets. He eventually saved enough money to begin raising beets through a sharecropping arrangement on I.D. O'Donnell's large farm in Hesper, a farm community a few miles west of Billings. "You must come to Billings," Anton wrote in a letter to my brother. or to my mother, excuse me, which she saved and that I read later. He described a thriving town where opportunity awaited a hardworking, honest person on every block. I go on to talk about how they came to Billings in December 1892, became naturalized. They became assimilated. And I will add, this is, I'm of third, let's see, what am I, a third generation American. My grandparents on both sides came from the area that we now is in the spotlight, the Ukraine, down by the Black Sea, migrated to the US and started farming first in North Dakota and then crossed over the line into Montana, did sugar beets. And when I grew up, my parents could still speak some German. They spoke German when they were in the church services. They were confirmed in German, but when the previous generation, the older generation, like my grandparents, they would still speak some German. Mostly we were convinced, my brothers and sisters and I, to keep secrets from us. And then as that generation died off, by the time my parents died, I still know maybe 5 or 6 German phrases, but they pretty much faded. That was the assimilation thing. And so I talk about how Arnie's advice from his parents is you have to speak good English. That's how you get ahead when you talk to the businessmen and farmers. And that he was not a difficult child, but his carefree tendencies tested my mother's patience. Arnie, stop and think before you do things, she said more than once, her aggravation causing her to throw in a German word. You're giving me gray hair with your Treband. I hope I pronounce it right, because my German is no good. And I go on to talk about how Arnie, already at the age of 8, looks at his father, who is making a good living for the time as a baker, but is that all there is? He's seeing airplanes. Montana is getting some early aviation. Montana was not a backwater state by any means, getting some of those early planes coming through here. And the idea of soaring in the sky has grabbed him to impress upon, I hope, on young people now that dreaming of adventure. When I was growing up, I hate to say it, back in the late 60s, the big thing was the first space flight. Are you going to go to the moon? Are you going to be an astronaut? And I'm not sure maybe I need to sit down with 6th and 7th graders now and find out what their big dreams are. But to impress upon young people that cars they had cars, they had telephones. It was not a technologically backward age, but the dreams of young people could well have been flight. And I will add that one of the impetuses for this book, before I be quiet, take your questions, was starting to do some research into a real life thing that I'm going to delve into in my next book, which is the fact that Charles Lindbergh, then an unknown son of a Minnesota congressman, came through Billings and Lewistown in 1922 as a barnstormer. He wasn't a pilot then, he was a wing walker with an outfit out of Lincoln, Nebraska. I started going into that and I said, I like the freedom that I have to get into the mindset of an adolescent back at that time. And I have a history minor also, so I appreciate the fellow writers who are history people. And that period, the 20s going into the 30s with Prohibition and everything. I'm not going to give away the whole story, but my character has different challenges, but it wasn't necessarily easy growing up 100 years ago either. I hope that message resonates with young readers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dennis. I'm curious what skills were you taking from your journalism career to write fiction, and what new skills did you have to develop to write fiction?
one of the skills that I knew that I used was the ability to do research, and it helped me with my previous 2 books. Nowadays, when I started and you wanted to go back in a newspaper, when I worked at the Gazette, it was called, and in many other newspapers, it was called the morgue. Don't you love that, where you had all kinds of old paper files and you had a microfilm machine, and you'd scroll through that thing and your eyes would get buggy and maybe you could make a printout. Well, nowadays, you can, with digital archives, you can find so many things. You get a sense of a time. It's not perfect, but you can find tidbits and you can anchor a story, as I tried to do here, in a period. That there was really this going on. I made up the story. I think the fancy word is verisimilitude. It could have happened back then. I'm not saying it did, but it could have happened. What was your other question, Jessica?
What new skills did you have to develop to do fiction?
New skills was to cut down on the amount of exposition and to show as much as tell, to learn effective dialogue. And one of the skills that I learned was I've worked with editors for a long time. I'm going to put in a plug for my editor, a fellow named that you probably know because his books are on your shelf, one of the best Montana novelists, current novelist, Craig Lancaster, a former newspaper copy editor. And it was Craig who helped me get better focus. And what he also did, this newspaper guy looked at it, but he's branched into fiction, and he said, and I was thinking of it as straight historic fiction for regular readers, and he said, you've got something for what he called it, middle readers. I said, never thought of that. So here we are. Yes, it's the new skills of thinking in terms of story. And I hope I don't offend any of the history people here, but one of my pet peeves is the way history has been taught when I was growing up. Bad history in classes and not bad history, but poorly taught, just dull recitation of facts. And the Civil War started with the firing on Fort Sumter and whatever and blah blah blah, and that's important to know. But letting young people know that there were real people, regular people like them, who were part of the society, and they're part of the history too. And if we learn from their stories and then go from that micro level up to the big people like Abe Lincoln and Jeff Davis and all those other people, I'm just saying the Civil War, that's good. But to just focus on the big figures gets a collective yawn from most young people.
True. Well, thank you so much, Dennis. New date. Ding, ding, ding. Time to switch your chairs. We are so excited to welcome Bill Lowry to share Requiem for America's Best Idea. Bill is actually the author of the foreword for this title, written in tandem with Michael Yosham, who's a very prolific writer about Yellowstone and some of the best loved places here in Montana. Sadly, Michael passed away in February of 2020 after a 7-year battle with ALS. So Bill, who's here, who authored the foreword for the book, continues as its champion in Michael's memory. Professor William Lowry studies American politics, environmental and energy policy, and natural resource issues. So, Bill, take us away.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be on the panel. All these books sound really interesting. I've enjoyed hearing about all of them. And yeah, as you mentioned, Jessica, I am speaking for Mike Yochum, who wrote this book, Requiem for America's Best Idea. And the reason that I'm here and Mike's not is part of the story of what I want to say about this book. It's actually makes it quite compelling, I think. And it's the book Requiem is actually 2 books in one. And one of them is, as Jessica mentioned, it's about the remarkable, wonderful natural places we have in the country and the places that Mike loves so much. And the concern about the impact that climate change is having on these places. Mike focuses mostly on the crown jewels of the national park system, Olympic, Grand Canyon, Glacier, Yellowstone, and Yosemite, and how climate change is impacting those places. And he's very thorough with what he describes in terms of climate change. And in fact, Mike was an incredibly careful writer, much more so than I ever have been, I think. And he documents everything quite extensively. There's over 300 footnotes in this thing, hundreds of sources, very scientific, very thorough. And I think most of the people listening to this will know, and without me reciting what these impacts are, what's going on in the national parks. And you don't have to go very far to see how climate change is affecting these places. The drought affecting the Grand Canyon, the fires in Yellowstone and Glacier, the loss of glaciers in Glacier National Park and Olympic National Park. These are all serious consequences of climate change. And Mike is really concerned about them. And that's part of the other story that this book is about. And that is, as Jessica mentioned, Mike, the author, he was a career employee of the National Park Service, worked mostly in Yellowstone and in Yosemite, and rose through the ranks, and a prolific hiker, backpacker, adventurer, great athlete, in excellent shape. In 2013, he was diagnosed with ALS. And I don't know how much most people in the audience know about ALS as a disease, but it's a terrible neurological disease that eats away at the body and physical capabilities while leaving the mind sharp, while leaving mental capacities intact. And so you're actually, for people that suffer from ALS, they're actually, it's like they're being trapped inside the body, and it's deteriorating, that will no longer function. Mike was diagnosed in 2013, and yet he continued to write. He of course, he had to end his career with the Park Service, but he wanted to keep writing. He finished one book and then wrote another book while he had ALS. And then this book, Requiem, which the thing that's remarkable about this book is Mike wrote the entire book with just his eyes. And the way that works is, again, you've probably seen Stephen Hawking in his voice machine, and Mike had one of those, but he also had an eye tracking machine, and he would literally sit at his computer and he would use his eyes to focus on one letter at a time, make one word at a time, then one sentence at a time, put them into a paragraph. It would take him hours to write a single paragraph. And this is meanwhile he knew he didn't have a lot of time left. ALS, very few people last more than 5 years. Stephen Hawking was kind of the exception. And Mike knew he was dying, and yet he was determined to finish this book, and he kept working on it. He would get up in the morning, he'd put 2 hours, he'd work for about 2 hours using this eye tracking machine. It was just, I'm sure it was just totally exhausting. And he would take a nap, he would get whatever he was getting. By then he was getting food through a portal in his stomach, so he'd get whatever sustenance he could, and then he would come back in the afternoon, he'd write 2 more hours. And he, sadly, in June of 2019, Mike and I were pretty good friends. I've written books about the parks, about national parks myself, and how politics affect national parks. And Mike and I had collaborated on some stuff in the past, and we were pretty good friends. I live in St. Louis, although my T-shirt says Red Lodge. I'm wishing I was in Montana, so with a lot of the rest of you. But I live in St. Louis, and Mike's parents lived in a place called Fenton, which is just outside of St. Louis. And when Mike's disease got worse, he moved in with his parents, who took care of him for years and did everything for him. And ALS is one of these diseases that you just need a lot of help and a lot of care. And so Mike and I, my wife and I would go out and visit him. And early on, we could take him for hikes when he had a wheelchair. But later on, it was just to go visit and to talk about this book and other things that he was working on. And in June of 2019, Mike asked me that in the event of his death that if I would finish the book for him. He knew it was coming, and he was determined to finish this. And of course I said yes. What else was I going to say? And I was happy to do it. I was proud to do it. And with the help of his family and some friends, we finished the book. We got it published, and I'm very proud of this book. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. And Mike, so the book is about both the climate change affecting the parks, and it's about Mike's experience with this disease. And it's very compelling. And that might sound unusual. And in fact, it did sound unusual to a lot of editors or a lot of publishers that I contacted after Mike's death to try to get published, because they really are. It sounds like two separate stories, but what the way that they come together is what makes it fascinating and makes it compelling. Mike, he had a line in this book where he said, because Mike could no longer, he loved the national parks. He spent as much time in them as he could. He basically, his life was national parks. And there's a line in this book where he said he could no longer visit the national parks because the disease had made it so bad for him. But his concern was that climate change was going to do the same thing to the rest of us. And his line was, "My experience may be the universal experience. And at some point, if we don't do something about climate change, it's going to be hard for any of us to go and visit these parks and enjoy them." I got a really trivial taste of this myself just last year, when my wife and I planned to go out to Yellowstone and Glacier in August. And those of you that live in Montana know it just was not a good time to go out to visit Yellowstone and Glacier. The fires were so bad, the smoke was so bad, and that's getting worse every summer, and we all know that that's happening. So that what brings the book together is that Mike had a perspective on this, on the impact of climate change on national parks that nobody else could have, because he was dying and he knew he wouldn't be able to see them again. For him, being able to fall back on his memories of national parks was a remarkable thing. It helped him a lot. Even when he couldn't move, he couldn't do anything else but sit there. At least he could remember these memories he had of backpacking trips or hikes in the national parks, and it gave him a lot of comfort. And he wished that everybody had that kind of experience, so that they could, if they needed to, they could fall back on that in the future. Now I'm going to finish up by saying I'm speaking from Mike, and I want to be able to I'm not always the most articulate person, and I want to be able to let some other people speak for Mike too, because I'm very proud of the endorsements and the reviews we've gotten in this book. So very briefly, so this is a review we've got several historians on the panel. This is a review by Kevin Mattson at Ohio University, who says, "What an amazing book." That was his first line. Here's an endorsement in the inside leaf cover from Jack Leffler, who many of you know wrote one of the best books about Ed Abbey that anybody's ever read. And Jack Leffler says, "One of the finest, most evocative books that I've ever read. It provides the realization that we are all born by the flow of nature through paradise in peril." On the back cover, Bill Mckibben, and everybody, I don't need to introduce Bill Mckibben, but Bill Mckibben said this is a crucial book. Gary Ferguson, who some of you know, another Montana native, and Gary writes, "Notably, while Yoakum is writing from the agonizing doorstep of his own death, this is less a book about dying than a tale about what it feels like to be truly alive." And what Gary's referring to is that in each chapter, Mike talks about a hike into the wilderness and how important that was to him and how much you could get out of such a hike. And it's really quite compelling. And then finally, Todd Wilkinson, another Montanan that many of you know. Wilkinson writes, "Imagine for a moment that you knew you were not long for the world, but wanted to offer a gift back to society, a message that could positively affect the lives of future generations." For Michael Yoakum, that's precisely what this book represents. And that's, I guess, what I'd like to finish with, is just that the book, it's a sounding an alarm about doing something about climate change. And I know there are people out there that still pay little attention to climate change, but if they don't care about what it's doing to national parks, then I'm not sure what you do to get them to pay attention. And so that's one thing, is to get people to think more seriously about and do and act more seriously about climate change. And the second part of it is, before this whole experience, I knew very little about ALS. Again, often people refer to it as Lou Gehrig's disease, for those of you who don't know much about it. And I guess I'd say now I know more than I wish I ever did know, because it's a terminal disease and there is no known cure for it. You can try and extend somebody's life for a while, but you can't do anything about it. So it's an important thing, I think, for people to understand the disease and to try to support efforts to try and fight ALS. And I would just mention that the family that has Mike's estate, all the proceeds they're getting from sales of this book go to the fight against ALS. Just something I wanted to make sure I mentioned. Again, I think it's an important book, and I think it's quite a compelling book. And I really encourage people to take a look at it. Thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you. Thank you for championing this book, because that is such an important conversation to continue to have as we face. Katherine is coming to us from Santa Fe, and there are already wildfires there. And I feel like there is maybe a morbid kind of beauty in the decline that accompanies ALS and the decline that we are watching right now on our planet, as we confront a lack of action so far in regards to climate change. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks for saying that. And you're exactly right. That's exactly Mike's point. There is a parallel between the two, and it's And again, I think he was the only guy that could see it as well as strongly as he did, as compellingly as he did.
Fantastic. Dennis has a question. Let's see here. As a Montana native, I've taken visits to Yellowstone for granted, but I worry it's being loved to death. I rarely go anymore because of all the congestion. Do you think access will have to be rationed somehow?
Yeah, so it's a big question, Dennis. Like I said, I've written about the parks for a long time, and I've visited them as much as I can. And I always try to be careful to say whatever I'm saying critical of the park and the Park Service, I don't want it to discourage people to visit. Having said, because they are such wonderful places. Having said that, you're quite right that there's a fear of loving them to death. So I think the Park Service will have to think more seriously about changing means of accessibility into a lot of the parks. And I guess the park I would think of as an example is Zion. And if anybody's been to Zion, you know how it works. You park on the outside, you either hike in or you ride buses in. And to me, it makes a lot of sense. Same thing at Denali. I don't know, it's going to be harder to do that at Yellowstone, but at some point they may have to, either they're going to have to do that or they're going to have to try to make it so that more people come there in off months rather than in the summer months when so many people, the visitation is like 70% of the visitation is in summer months. So if people would go in off months to a lot of these parks, it would help a lot. There's one other answer to that question that I'd like to say, and that is people worry about loving the parks to death. I guess, so I wrote an editorial about this book, and the point I was trying to make was maybe we're not loving them enough, because if we were loving them enough, we would do something about climate change, and we aren't doing it yet. Sorry, I don't mean to get on my soapbox.
No, that was very beautifully said. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, if you haven't picked up your copy of A Requiem for America's Best Idea, there is a link in the chat. But it is time for our final date of the evening. We are going to hear from Katherine Standefer about lightning flowers. Katherine Standefer's debut book, Lightning Flowers, was a finalist for the 2021 Kirkus Prize in Nonfiction, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and Staff Pick, and it was shortlisted for the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Prize from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the Nyman Foundation at the Harvard University. Her previous writing appeared in the Best American Essays of 2016. Standifer is a 2018 Logan Nonfiction Fellow at the Carey Institute for Global Good and earned her MFA in nonfiction at the University of Arizona. She writes from a juniper and pinyon-studded mesa in New Mexico, where she lives with her chickens. I haven't seen the chickens yet, Katherine. I might call you on that one. Zoom pets are the best pets. So Katherine, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a treat to be here. And yeah, if anyone saw the chicken pop on a few minutes ago, sorry about that. It's been a while since I did an evening event and the light is hitting really differently. And I was sort of blinding myself and wouldn't have been visible to all of you without moving. It's a treat to be at Country Bookshelf. I wrote quite a bit of this book from Greater Yellowstone. For a while, I was posted up on Wineglass Mountain in Livingston and spent some time in Bozeman and visited a bunch of hot springs in the area. But the real regionality of this book really comes from its opening. The story that this book begins with is a day in June of 2009 when I was a 24-year-old ski instructor and hiking guide living in Jackson Hole. And I went into cardiac arrest in a parking lot while uninsured in a pre-Obamacare United States. So there's the warning shot. The story takes off from there. I had no idea that I had a genetic arrhythmia, although I could have potentially had an idea had I gone into the hospital to get an EKG at any point. My younger sister, Christine, had already started going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room down at University of Colorado Boulder when she was 18 and 19 years old. And so she already had implanted in her chest a cardiac defibrillator, which is the slightly smaller cousin of the pacemaker. Pacemakers send heart send little bits of electricity to the heart to keep it beating, whereas defibrillators reverse arrhythmias. They're more like the paddles in the ER. And so they can prevent sudden cardiac death. And so Christine had started going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room. It took several months before anyone figured out why she was passing out. She had had this device implanted about 1.5 years before I went down in a parking lot. And you can imagine, as a 24-year-old, I was pretty invincible, especially one who taught skiing and climbing. And I think some part of me knew that if anyone else in the family had it, it was probably me. And that's why I didn't go in to get checked. But once I woke up in the parking lot with gravel in my forehead near the Jackson Hole Center for Fine Arts, I had to follow up. I worried that I would die every day and had to figure out how you access heart surgery during the era of pre-existing conditions still being sort of barred by insurers. And that surgery was estimated at $180,000 out of pocket. So the book Lightning Flowers is a reckoning with what it means to be young and ill, and the ways your life changes and how it impacts your relationships. It's also really a reckoning with the device itself. So I did end up getting an ICD. I actually quit my life in Jackson and moved 500 miles away to Boulder, where my younger sister's surgeon said he would help me. He helped me figure out how to establish residency, and then said that if I did the procedure at Boulder Community Hospital, he would donate his fee. And he ended up rallying behind me to get other practitioners to donate their fees, and St. Jude Medical donated my device. But that's really only the opening of what becomes a very complex story, because an ICD, the implanted cardiac defibrillator, is a technology that we think of as being life-saving. And in my experience, unfortunately, as the story goes on, it comes to threaten my life as often as it could save my life. At the point of this writing, my ICD has never saved my life, and it ends up causing, throughout the course of the book, a series of complications that were quite serious and impacted my life an extraordinary amount. So Lightning Flowers is the story of my journey through the American healthcare system, both pre-Obamacare and then post passage of the Affordable Care Act. And it's also the story of my global reckoning with what it means to make what we think of as a life-saving device. So the actual prologue of the book opens on a night in 2012 when I'm on a soccer field in Tucson, Arizona, where I had just moved for grad school. And I was playing intramural soccer, and some guy had fallen and the game stopped, and we're all kind of waiting for him to get up. And all of a sudden I heard screaming, and I didn't know what it was until I realized my hands had become claws, and the screaming was me. And it was my cardiac defibrillator going off for the first time, shocking me with 860 volts each time. It shouldn't be shocking you when you're awake. It should be shocking you when you're lying on the ground unconscious, because blood isn't pumping. And so I suspected immediately that something was wrong, but I couldn't really think about it because, you know, it hit me once, and then it hit me again, and then it hit me again. And luckily I had a yoga practice, and some voice inside me said, you can either scream or breathe. And so I began to deep breathe, and that shifted my heart rate enough that the device stopped shocking me. And so on that night, I had this very strange experience lying on this soccer field, waiting for the paramedics to arrive and smelling my own burned tissues. And I found myself thinking, what is this thing inside me? You know, in the weeks after those shocks, I really experienced it as a predator inside me. It could go off at any time. I wasn't in control of it. When I went in to get it checked out, the medical practitioners who I worked with really dismissed me. They really acted as though this were a normal experience to have. And of course, if you are checking cardiac defibrillators, you do see a lot of patients receiving abnormal shocks, accidental shocks, or even shocks that are very scary, but were necessary to the stability of the heart. And yet that doesn't mean that that's actually a normal experience for a human being to have. In any other period of history, to be shocked by that kind of electricity would be nothing short of a signal from the gods, right? It would be some kind of spiritual experience. And so I really started asking, what is this inside me? How do I understand what this is? And it occurred to me lying on that field that the metal inside my body had to come from somewhere. And I wondered if it was possible that that metal had come from a place that experienced conflict. Like, what if this was a mine that had been taken over by warlords? What if there were women kept as sex slaves? I was very aware at the time in 2012 that the Congo was known as the rape capital of the world, and that our appetite for consumer electronics in the US had led to spikes in the prices of particular metals that were accessible via shovel and pit, and that there were armed groups taking over mines in the Eastern DRC and forcing people to work, extorting labor, keeping sex slaves, all of the things I previously mentioned. And so kind of as a way of surviving this experience, I began to research, is it possible that I have conflict minerals inside my body? And that was a really complicated question to ask, because in the US, we're not very good at paying attention to our supply chains. A lot of the companies involved had no idea where their minerals came from, or where their products, materials, period, came from. One interesting thing is that in the wake of the recession, in 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, a financial reform legislation, and that legislation actually included a strange rider related to conflict minerals. And it basically specified that any company working on the US-based stock exchanges would need to report whether or not their products contained minerals that were from the Great Lakes region of Africa. So the Congo, Rwanda, Tanzania, I'm suddenly blanking on the other ones, but basically anywhere in Central Africa right there. And so companies started actually having to look, and it wasn't a punitive law. It wasn't saying you have to pay a fine if you are sourcing from the Congo. It just was a way of getting companies to figure out, do they even know where they're sourcing things from? And then because they had to explicitly state in their stock exchange materials, their reports at the end of the year, whether or not they had materials from the Congo, that meant that then consumers and consumer interest groups could highlight them if they were sourcing from conflict minerals areas. So there was a little bit of a movement toward being able to track these things down, but not enough, not nearly enough at the time I was looking. So I really went down a rabbit hole in terms of the Congo and Rwanda, but I ultimately came out of that rabbit hole and got really interested in the opposite question. So, okay, here are all of the worst case scenarios for where the materials in my life-saving medical device could come from. Are there best case scenarios? And I ended up traveling to Madagascar to a brand new nickel and cobalt mine being carved out of endemic jungle in the high spine of the country, which has been lauded as a model for corporate social responsibility. What I found there was much, much more complicated in terms of the impacts of that type of deforestation, some of the indigenous land rights issues, endangered animals that, of course, Madagascar being an island, they're only found right there on that part of the planet. And I also visited a Rio Tinto owned mine that was a titanium sands mine at the southern end of that country. Titanium sand mostly becoming titanium oxide, which is the white dye that goes into our paint, our pigment, or into our toothpaste, but also the titanium that could be in a defibrillator can. And I didn't say it before, but nickel and cobalt from the other mine, that is material that could be in the microelectronics motherboard of my device, or cobalt is often in the battery. So basically the book ends up being this journey to Madagascar, South Africa, and Rwanda to reckon with what it takes to make a life-saving device, and really thinking about what that means for my life and why my life is worth it. And then it's also this story of wandering through the American healthcare system, feeling how policy and politics impact the life that I'm able to live, and also really coming to just understand what it means to live in relationship to death. What are the interventions that we undertake to solve death or stop death? And what does it mean that there's this ultimate truth that we are all going to die anyway? And how do you make decisions in light of that? And once you're aware of the potential of your own death, how do you still live a life? So there's a lot there. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I feel like this provides a really unique perspective. I feel like a lot of the times, even in like procedural medical dramas, when they're talking about the implant of things, that, you know, you have the conservative Jewish person that's like, no, I won't take a porcine valve or something like that. But just the basics of where do these materials come from, I think is a huge question. And I mean, even just in the book world, like, was Lightning Flowers impacted by the supply chain issues of the last year and a half?
I feel like I got lucky in that it did not really.
Good. Yes.
Certainly was affected by everything else. Lightning Flowers originally came out on November 10th, 2020. So I could not do in-person events, and it was an interesting moment for it to come out because suddenly everyone was thinking about death in a different way.
Yeah.
The reason I'm here tonight, I guess I haven't shown it yet. The paperback just came out.
Yay!
Beautiful. This is the beautiful hardcover.
They're both beautiful.
Thank you.
Would you explain what a lightning flower is?
Oh, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Lightning flowers are the thin branched burns that can occur on someone's body as the result of lightning strike. So when electricity hits the body, it follows the path of water. And so you can end up with these very spidery, beautiful fern-like burns where it's following the vein systems. And so it's actually on the outside of the skin. You should Google it. It's gorgeous, but also deeply disturbing because they are burns. And so I looked up lightning flowers several times in the wake of the shocks that I took because it was so unnerving that there was no mark on my body. Mm-hmm. But having smelled my own burned tissues, I was really trying to figure out, like, what's the amount of electricity that causes cellular damage within a body? And is it possible that I actually do have some kind of internal mark of what has happened? But ultimately, my whole life is the mark of this device, right? The way that this device entered my body and attached me to our healthcare system and attached me to experiences of having to fight for my bodily autonomy in various ways and confront my mortality, and really think about the ways that I'm connected to all these other places and beings. All of that is a lightning flower. So yeah, when you look at the cover, these are lightning flowers. That's roughly what they look like. And one of the things that was cool with my publisher was talking about how lightning flowers really look a lot like veins, like blood vessels, like trees, like when you fly over land and you see all the arroyos spreading out. It was sort of like these veins of the earth. And of course, veins of the earth are, that's terminology often used for mining and minerals. So there is like a really beautiful convergence of the way that term worked for me.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank everyone so much for coming tonight and sharing your stories with us. Let me get this link in the chat one more time. If you haven't purchased your copy of any of the books or all of the books, you can find them all here at the link in the chat. We are so grateful to have had all of you, and stay tuned for our next bi-monthly. That's 2 months from now. So we'll see you again in July.
Thank you, Jessica.
For having us. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
All right.